I was so hyper obsessed with how I was being perceived that it was keeping me from being honest and vulnerable and open. And it didn't allow me to turn that negative into a positive until a long time after, right? Until I was able to say, oh, actually, I can use the imposter syndrome as inspiration because it's only here because I'm putting myself out of my comfort zone, right? Like it's actually, imposter syndrome is often a sign that you're doing something right.
Welcome to Amplify with Jess Ekstrom, a show designed to help women get out of their head and into their zone of influence. Today's guest is Lindsey Epperly, CEO of JetSet World Travel and host of Who Made You the Boss podcast. Her keynote talks about burnout, imposter syndrome, which we will definitely get into, but her story is incredible, from losing her home to leading a business into the Inc. 5000 list of fastest growing companies. And the story begins with her fiance, now husband, joining her in 2018 to help her grow the travel company.
So now we are a couple with all eggs in one basket. Fast forward to March of 2020. Everyone knows that month for the rest of their lives, right? I am 5 months pregnant with our first child. We are in business together. We have a home under contract. Everything's going up and to the right until suddenly it is not. World pandemic, not the time to be in the travel industry.
Travel business. Yeah.
Yeah. The amazing thing, and a lot of what I think we'll talk about today is kind of how you can turn those obstacles into your opportunities, right?
Yeah.
Like every single thing that fell apart in March of 2020 is exactly what led us to winding up on the Inc. 5000 list, more than quadrupling throughout the pandemic. We were able to seize an acquisition opportunity, just insane amounts of growth. I had goals for myself. I was in my early 30s when this happened. I had goals for myself to hit by the time I was 40. And we managed to hit every single one of those goals in the 2 years following the pandemic because of everything that happened, right? Because of the way we were able to look at it and say, actually, could we use some of these opportunities for our benefit instead of just looking at them as obstacles? I mean, you had a recent podcast about this, right? Like about you're here, make the most of it.
Yeah.
And that's what we really did.
So walk me through, because that is, yes, I could sing that all day long, but when you're in the moment and you're like, holy cow, this vision that I had of moving into this house, all of this is going away. How do you not jump to like a scarcity mindset? I mean, I feel like in hindsight, you could say, oh yeah, like use what you have. And we now have created this thing, but like, what were the actual moments?
Yeah. I mean, I'm saying all of this with like silver lining voice, right? But it was not like that in the moment. In the moment, having to make the choice between, do I keep my business or do I keep my home? And, you know, you're already so in love with this idea of where you're bringing your daughter home to, and it's got an interior brick wall and it's so beautiful and nothing's ever going to replace that, right? Like that was a very painful choice of, do we move forward with something material for an even greater risk, right? We believe in this business, but it's not looking so good right now. And so honestly, we had to hold a lot of that optimism, which I'm a very emotionally driven person. So it wasn't optimism.
You and I both,
day.
sister. Yeah.
Thank God for good partnerships. My husband, during this time, we decided to make him my business partner. And so he was able to be a very stable force during that time and say, wait a minute, we've got a spreadsheet for this. It's on the whiteboard. There's a plan, right? So when I would get emotional, we would go back. We had a spreadsheet titled Project Slim Fast because it was all about reducing our expenses and encouraging our run rate. So let's look at Project Slim Fast. It's saying we can list, we can exist for another 3 months here. We can make another, government came out with a program. Oh, that's another 3 months for us. So it was like just keeping this thing in check and saying, all right, in reality, what's this going to look like for the next few months? And once we get to a certain number, either in our bank account or, what that looks like, then we can press the big red button of we've got to do something else. But we just kept surviving. And really the optimism was so important for our team because we're leading a team at the time. They're showing up every day. They're so, they love planning travel. And all they're doing at the time is canceling trips, postponing trips, like really being in it with their travelers and feeling that pain and hardship of, oh man, they had this dream and now the dream's not going to happen. Everyone's bummed besides the whole existential crisis that everyone's going through. And
small detail.
Small detail. So we had to show up as leaders and set a mission for everyone. And that was what got the team through. Was our mission was to be a beacon during our industry's darkest hour. So we actually created programs. We invited in our competitors. we were, it was all about community over competition. And all of that's what led to so many opportunities on the other side.
And the decision, I'm actually selfishly curious about this, the decision to involve your husband and be business partners and spouses is something I can relate to. What was that journey like for you? Because it definitely, for us, was some growing pains at first.
Yes, definitely. And you know what's interesting, Jess? Because the pandemic happened so early on, because like the leveling of this business happened just a couple of years, actually less than a couple of years into us working together. Success can cover a lot of ignorance and a lot of flaws, right? So like when you're doing well, you kind of don't have to look at the cracks in the foundation. But when that rug is pulled out, then it's like, oh, wow, we've got a lot of issues to solve here, don't we?
Yeah.
So
I feel like that could either bring you together or pull you apart. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. We have a couple of kind of checks and balances in place. One is that Jeremy literally has a resignation letter typed up on his computer that he can press print on at any time should the marriage be in jeopardy.
That is amazing. Jake, if he's listening, he's like, oh, I'm going to write my resignation letter today. Probably.
Have that saved on your desktop, Jake. But what the journey was like is we decided what we wanted to craft for our family, which was a lifestyle of freedom and flexibility, and entrepreneurship can bring that. And Jeremy's background, he has his MBA. He was working in finance at the time, but he wasn't working for himself. And so this was an avenue to getting us both in a position where we were working for ourselves.
Yeah. It's interesting, like how you married someone who, what do you call left brain and your right brain? I did the same thing. And I would say like 90% of the time in your relationship and in your business, those like differences are great because he catches for what I lack and vice versa, and the things that scare me that I don't want to do. That's like the things that excite him, like spreadsheets and all that stuff, versus writing email copy. He's like, what do you want me to say? Just tell them to buy it. Like, and I'm like, you can't do that. And so 90% of the time it's great. And then the 10% of the time it's like, well, why don't you think about this the way that I think about this? Yeah.
Right. I found that journey was one of, you have to actually be cognizant of giving professional respect to each other, because like, in your home life, you love this person more than anyone, right? Like you give easy, instant respect because of the way that you fell in love. But I found that work Jeremy and work Lindsey were not madly in love, and they had to learn how to get along.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, you show up as a different person at work,
Yeah. The other thing that I feel has been something that I've struggled with, like most of the time, I mean, working with Jake has been amazing, but you would complain to your spouse about your boss if you worked somewhere else, or like work issues. You just kind of like when you're at dinner be like, oh my gosh, this person or this thing happened. When it's a business that you run together, just being on the receiving end of that just kind of one-off banter that you should be able to have with your spouse adds a different layer to it. And so we've definitely had to set boundaries and expectations, because he's someone who can like, it could be 9:30 p.m. and he could be like, oh yeah, like I filed our taxes, or talk about something and then be like, good night. Where I'm thinking like, at 11 p.m., well, what about this and the taxes? And he's so good at just like on, off, where I am like always flickering on and off. And so having to figure out like when I want to be there for him on the receiving end of things that bother him or stress him out, just like you would in any other role. But there has to be timing and thought behind it. Do you ever find that?
Oh, totally. We have a weekly date where we just parking lot those ideas, because otherwise they'll interrupt the whole flow of the day.
Yes.
Something else that I picked up on that you and I can relate, and I'm, maybe there are the rare listeners that have this exact scenario, but like when you are the female founder as well, so like you founded this company, there is this kind of relationship that you have with your company that feels so weird when you bring someone else in. And then sometimes it's hard not to take things personal if they're questioning how things are done. And you're like, well, because my gut said to do it that way, and then talk about imposter syndrome where you're having to like hold your own self accountable for the business you've created. And you're like, but I'm just kind of doing the best I can over here.
Yes. Well, let's talk about imposter syndrome because you have so many great takes on imposter syndrome, how that can lead to burnout. Obviously, that's something in the speaking industry that is so prevalent and also especially with women. What has your journey been like with imposter syndrome, whether that's starting your business, your podcast, Who Made You the Boss? What has that been like for you?
Yeah, it's been such an important through line. You talk about listening to the chorus, and it has been a chorus for me because, yes, from the very beginning, when you're starting a business, I think there's a level of like, well, who the heck am I to do this, right? That's why I named the show Who Made You the Boss, because
I love
as
it.
an entrepreneur, you look yourself in the mirror, as a speaker, as whoever, you are the boss now, and you've got to own up to that. But the real journey with imposter syndrome for me, the place where it reared its ugly, ugly head the worst was during that season of what I perceived as failure because the business was just absolutely, in the red for months and months. And I had unknowingly tied my self-worth to my success, which is such an easy thing to do as a high achiever and just given our hustle culture. And I'll tell you where it really came to a head was at the end of 2020, we wound up going on this amazing entrepreneurial retreat to a private island that I had always dreamed of. And the only reason we did this is because we had paid for it a year prior. So we did not know when we felt like we were going to be successful enough to go on this retreat, amongst like Tony Robbins' inner circle, that we were going to be gigantic failures at the time is what we felt or what I felt. I can't speak for Jeremy. But being on there, so we go on this retreat and I'm like, should I just like write this in Sharpie on my forehead that like loser, failure, the business is clearly not doing well. Like everyone has to know, right? And so that's where imposter syndrome really got the worst of me. And I remember just showing up and being like, had this feeling in my gut, I just wasn't myself. I'm like, well, they know, can they tell? And it took months and months of reflection after that. And I actually have written a lot about it. I put a lot into my podcast about this specific incident because I was so hyper obsessed with how I was being perceived that it was keeping me from being honest and vulnerable and open. And it didn't allow me to turn that negative into a positive until a long time after, right? Until I was able to say, oh, actually, I can use the imposter syndrome as inspiration because it's only here because I'm putting myself out of my comfort zone, right? Like it's actually, imposter syndrome is often a sign that you're doing something right.
Mm. The imposter syndrome, like you're not going to feel it if you're sitting in your comfort zone. You'll feel it when you get accepted to that TED Talk or you go host that retreat or things that make you stretch a little bit. But let's talk about when you do feel it. What do you do? Because it's so easy to interpret those like, well, then this must mean I'm not qualified if the voice in my head is telling me that I'm not. So how do we react in those times?
Yeah. I think that the common rhetoric is to silence it. There's been a big push to just like get rid of the imposter syndrome, silence the inner critic, just shut it down. And while I don't believe in letting it take free reign and just help having you spiral, I think there's actually an approach that I do, which is more to acknowledge it, right? I think Brene Brown is the one who talks about studying your emotions like a scientist. And I think this is very true of imposter syndrome. And so for me, when I feel it kind of rearing up, I like to actually like take a step back and try to think through, okay, well, what emotions are these tied to? Where is the actual fear here? Can we even actually, a new friend of mine, Amy Schoenthal, wrote a book called The Setback Cycle, where she talks about like naming her inner critic, and let's give it a name, right? Let's put a persona around this person that is here and is speaking negatively to you, so you can better address them and say, okay, actually, I'm glad that you're here because it means I'm doing something right because my inner critic is here. But we're going to address the points that you made, and I'm going to make sure that I move through the fear because I'm actually acknowledging it.
Yeah. And I think that there's like two different takes on how to quiet your imposter syndrome. And I feel like they could be used in two different scenarios. There are some times when I have the runway or when something is really getting in my head, maybe it's like, I don't know if I should write another book. I don't know what people will think. I don't know what they'll say. And I can really name that inner critic, figure out where it's coming from. But then there's some times where imposter syndrome happens in the moment, or you're in a meeting, or you're on a Zoom call, or whatever it is, and you don't have the time to be like, let's dissect this. And so I think sometimes even just knowing like, oh yeah, it's normal, it's going to pass, without giving yourself the burden of like, who is it? Where's it coming from? What am I going to do? Is also kind of freeing, where you're like, yeah, this is normal. It's because I'm reaching. Do you find that?
Yeah. And I think it's a really, really good point. And I think too, arming ourselves with the facts is really important so that you can have those moments where you just let it ride. I think about it. So many of your listeners are speakers, and more than likely that means that yesterday they weren't a speaker, but today they are because they have made the transition of some sort, right? Is that what it looks like? Because in my
Yeah.
industry, I run a travel agency. I run JetSet World Travel, and there's no barrier to entry into becoming a travel advisor, right? Like it was yesterday you were not one, today you are. We're going to make sure you're trained, but then there's a lot of insecurities that come with that because like, well, I didn't get my MBA in travel. Like I didn't get my MBA in speaking. I didn't get, so how do you prove to yourself that you are where you should be? And I think it's more like acknowledging where you are, but also, hey, I just completed Mic Drop Workshop. I've got that on the average human that has not, right? That makes me more of a speaker than I was the day before I completed it. So knowing those credentials, right, for my travel advisors, I'm like, look, you're now part of a network. You've now gone through the training. You've got a guy in Iceland you can call that you didn't have before you started this, right? So just thinking through like what gives you more confidence.
But that's such a good point, because there's so many industries where it's like, I now have my doctorate and I can cure patients, or I now have this badge that I can wear where people trust me. But like a podcaster, a speaker, a lot of these stuff like in coaching, that it's great because there are certifications. But with speaking, a lot of people are like, well, can I put the word speaker on my website if I haven't done it yet? It's like, well, yeah, how are people supposed to know that this is something that you want to do if you haven't claimed it? So it can be uncomfortable, especially for women, to like start claiming something and stepping into it without someone telling them, you deserve this. And I want to also touch on this study that I read recently. I think it was through MIT, about like how imposter syndrome, affects 75% of executive women. So women that we think like have it, 75% of them have imposter syndrome. And then imposter syndrome leads to more burnout in women than it does men, because when men experience imposter syndrome, a lot of times they inflate confidence, almost like a fake it till you make it fallacy, where women go, what else can I do to prove myself? Which we all know is like pouring water in a leaky barrel. Like you're never going to feel like, oh, I'm the expert now. So imposter syndrome, especially in women, which I can relate to, can lead to burnout, which is also something that you advise and help people with. What are some things that when we are just in that overachieving, I need one more thing to feel good about myself, what do we do?
Yeah. You just made a lot of great points. And I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that there's a fallacy around imposter syndrome that the more successful you get, the quieter that voice will get. And I've actually found that to be the opposite, right? The more successful you get, the more isolated you will feel because you are stepping into a role that you've never done before. And you might have less individuals who can relate to that role. And so it starts becoming more, lonelier. But I will say I tie this to burnout because I think of each of the times that I had major evolutions in my career, just in life in general. And they were almost always a byproduct of a season of burnout. And it was because I wasn't listening to my gut or my intuition, which was saying, hey, instead of putting yourself in front of that punching bag that you've been doing year and year and year, maybe consider moving up into a different position, because whatever you're trying to do. So I'll give you the better example here is I always had male mentors who were fabulous, But they would tell me, you just need to get thicker skin. Like it was always the rhetoric, right? Just get thicker skin. Like I could just go buy it at Staples or something. And so the idea was, well, I just need to callous myself. I need to keep inserting myself into those moments of negativity that are causing me emotional, disparity and burnout. And I would just wallow in that kind of place until I realized, wait a minute, actually, the thin skin idea, the reason that I'm feeling that is because I think my whole body is actually saying, like, listen, it is time for you to move up and evolve from the position that you're in. And that means you're opening up a new career path for someone else who might enjoy it. Not that anyone enjoys being in that position, but some people enjoy customer service more than others. So situations like that. So for me, burnout has always been a sign instead of just a symptom toward evolution.
Interesting. Because the idea of burnout not being a symptom, but a sign can be really like posing another question. Because when I think of burnout, I think of like, what do I need to eliminate instead of what do I need to evolve or what do I need to step into? Like what is not working? And for anyone listening, you and I, when I was on Who Made You the Boss on your podcast, we talked about this in the context of motherhood and postpartum and balancing that and running a business. So definitely go over to Who Made You the Boss and find our episode because it is like one of those things where I forgot I was on a podcast. It's like, let's just talk about this because there is no better correlation between burnout and evolution than the product of motherhood, which I appreciate how transparent and helpful you were in that. I talk about what you said about like leaving breadcrumbs for yourself in that postpartum journey. Like, and as I'm about to deliver this baby, I am doing that a lot. So I really appreciate that. But Lindsey, where else, like if I was a speaker and I was just getting started and I was feeling imposter syndrome and wondering like, maybe I shouldn't do this, what advice would you have for someone who's like just getting started in their speaking journey?
I can first thank you for saying all of that about our conversation
Yeah.
on Who Made You the Boss, because I can completely relate. It's why I actually chose our episode to launch our second season, because it's such a good conversation. And you showed up as a whole human, and we're willing to go there and talk about the struggles with motherhood. And, much like we're talking about all of this today, I think it's so important that we acknowledge like this is challenging. And especially as a high achieving independent woman, like what does this look like for my identity now? When it comes to being a speaker starting out today, and listen, for the listeners, like I can completely relate to this. I too am embarking on more speaking, and I too feel those tendrils of imposter syndrome more than ever to say, well, who are you to get up on a stage and share your passion? I've done it in years past, but I took a couple years off due to maternity, and now we're on the other side, and I feel like I'm starting back at square one. When it comes to that imposter syndrome, I think I'd kind of echo what I said earlier about arming yourself with the facts about yourself. So it's not just your credentials. It's great. You need to go through Mic Drop Workshop. That is a wonderful credential. I can speak to it since I went through it before interviewing you. It's fabulous. But also why you and why your voice and why now, right? You're answering those questions through Mic Drop. So I almost feel like writing those, printing those, putting those beside your computer to remind yourself you are the right vessel for this. And actually, when I first engaged in speaking years ago, I remember being really nervous before going onto my first stage and going to my therapist about it, right? And at the time I was going to like a very meditation-based therapist. She was fantastic. She would kind of help me like drop into my body and see how certain things felt. And I will never forget her saying, all right, you've got a message, but what if that message is actually sent to you from something larger, right? I'm a very faith-based individual. So like that message is from God and you are simply the vessel here. So take your ego out of it. So maybe that's where we look at as a beginning speaker is you've got a message. That's a higher gift from whatever it is that you believe in, but you are just the vessel. So it has nothing to do with the way that you look or the way that you're going to appear or the way, like all the things that we, especially as women, get caught up in. It's about being the vessel to deliver that message. You're the one with it. It is yours. You get to steward that.
Yes, we talk about that in Mic Drop, being the lighthouse speaker versus a spotlight speaker. Spotlight, how will I look? How will I seem? Lighthouse, how can I be the vessel? How can I guide people here? And so as it comes to imposter syndrome, it's almost like, well, it's not about you. I saw some quote, or maybe it's funny. I'm like, I saw some quote, I read some book. It was like, really, I saw a TikTok. Someone was like, I'm experiencing a lot of imposter syndrome and self-doubt and insecurity. And I would not be this harsh with someone. But the response was like, wow, you think about yourself a lot. And it was like, oh, that's one way to look at it. Like, I don't think that is the solution to all of it, but it does pose the question of like, oh yeah, I'm making this a lot about me when it should be about them. I am the vessel, and I love that. Lindsey, where else can people find you? Definitely subscribe to Who Made You the Boss, find our episode, but where else can people meet you?
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I am so passionate about Who Made You the Boss and the conversations we're having. The easiest way to connect with me and find all of the things that I'm doing is just visit lindseyepperly.com. It's LindseyEpperly.com. That's going to have links to everything about Who Made You the Boss, as well as my newsletter and my writing, and then ways you can connect with me because I love hearing from people individually. So feel free to shoot me a DM.
Love it. We will put it in the show notes. Lindsey, you are the best. Thanks for coming on Amplify, and I'm sure we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Jess.
Thanks for listening to Amplify. If you are a fan of the show, show us some podcast love by giving us a rating and review. And give us a follow at Mic Drop Workshop and at Jess Ekstrom. This episode was edited and produced by Earfluence, and I'm Jess Ekstrom, your host. Remember that you deserve the biggest stage, so let's find out how to get you there. I'll see you again soon.